A Room of One's Own is an extended essay by Virginia Woolf, first published in September 1929. The work is based on 2 lectures Woolf delivered in October 1928 at Newnham College and Girton College, women's constituent colleges at the University of Cambridge. An important feminist text, the essay is noted in its argument for both a literal and figurative space for women's writers within a literary tradition dominated by men. The essay was based on 2 papers Woolf read on 20 and 26 October 1928 to 2 Cambridge student societies, the Newnham Arts Society at Newnham College and the Apporach Society at Girton College, respectively. Elsie Duncan Jones, then known as Elsie Farr, was the president of the Newnham Arts Society at the time and wrote an account of the paper, Women in Fiction, for the college magazine, Theseus. Woolf stayed at Newnham at the invitation of Pernell Strachey, the college principal, whose family were key members of the Bloomsbury Group. At Girton she was accompanied by Vita Sackville West. It was published in 1929 as a book with 6 chapters. The 4 major themes. 1. The 4 Marys. 2. Women's access to education. 3. Building a history of women's writing. 4. Lesbianism. A Room of One's Own. Summary of Chapter 1. Virginia Woolf, asked to give a lecture on women and fiction, tells her audience what she thought the title might mean: what women are like, the fiction women write, the fiction written about women, or a combination of the 3. However, she felt she could not form a conclusive truth about those subjects, and instead has come up with one minor point: a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. She says she will use devices of fiction in relating how her thoughts on the lecture mingled with her daily life. She uses a fictional narrator whom she calls Mary Betton as her alter ego, and the essay begins. A week ago, while sitting by a river, the narrator compares the production of a thought of hers on women and fiction, which she will not relate now, though she says one may detect it in the course of her lecture, to a fisherman's catch, albeit a measly one which he throws back. Nevertheless, the thought excites her, and as she hurries across a lawn at the fictional Oxbridge, a beadle, a minor parish official, intercepts her. Only fellows and scholars, not women, are allowed on the lawn. The interruption makes her forget her thought. Instead, she ponders the genius of literary figures, such as Milton and Thackeray, and goes to the library. An elderly man there informs her that women are admitted only with a fellow or a letter of introduction. She angrily vows to herself never to ask for that hospitality again of entering the library. She passes the chapel, listening to the organ and watching the congregation troop inside, but does not want to enter, as she would be denied permission again. She reflects on the royal wealth that had gone into building the university. The wealth now comes from independent men. She goes to lunch and describes the May food on display: soles, partridges, a delicious dessert, and excellent wine. The good food and relaxing atmosphere inspire rational intercourse in the conversation. She sees a Manx cat without a tail walking across the quadrangle, and suddenly feels that something is lacking. She thinks back on a pre-war luncheon in which people said the same things as now but sounded more musical. She walks through the late October afternoon to Newnham, the women's college where she is staying as a guest. She has a dinner of plain soup, mediocre beef, vegetables, and potatoes, and bad custard, prunes, biscuits and cheese, along with water. She feels one cannot think well, love well, sleep well, if one has not dined well. A friend of hers, Mary Seton, referred to hereafter as Seton, has a bottle of a good drink, and they drink and talk by the fire. The narrator thinks more about the kings in the past and financial magnates of their time who have built the colleges with their gold. She wonders what lies beneath their college. Seton summarizes how funds were raised with difficulty for the college, and therefore why they cannot afford expensive meals. The narrator and Seton denounce their mothers, and their sex, for being so impoverished and leaving their daughters so little. Had they been independently wealthy, perhaps they could have founded fellowships and secured similar luxuries for women. However, the narrator realizes that had Seton's mother gone into business, she would not have had Seton or the rest of her children. Moreover, only for the last 48 years have women been allowed to keep money they earned. Before that, it belonged to their husbands. Walking back to her inn, the narrator thinks about the effects of wealth and poverty on the mind, about the prosperity of males and the poverty of females, and about the effects of tradition or lack of tradition on the writer, among other topics. She goes to sleep, as does everyone in Oxbridge. A room of one's own. Summary of Chapter 2. Searching for answers to the questions she posed about men, women, wealth, and creativity, the narrator explores the British Museum in London. She soon realizes there are too many books written about women, almost all by men, for her to digest them all. On the other hand, there are hardly any books by women on men. She wonders why there is such a great disparity, and randomly selects a dozen books. Trying to come up with an answer for why women are poor, she locates a multitude of other topics on women in the books, and a contradictory array of men's opinions on women. Frustrated, she unwittingly draws a picture of an unattractive, angry-looking professor at work on one of the books about the inferiority of women. It occurs to her that she has become angry because the professor has written angrily himself. Had he written dispassionately, she would have paid more attention to his argument, and not to him. After her anger dissipates, she wonders why these men are all angry. She returns the books, finding them useless, and goes to lunch. She reads the newspaper at lunch, and reflects that anyone reading it would find that England is a patriarchal society. Men have all the power and money, hold all the important positions, make all the important decisions. The narrator knows that men are angry, however, and wonders why they would be angry with so much power. She wonders if holding power produces anger out of fear that others will take one's power. She then thinks that the men are not truly angry, but that when they pronounce the inferiority of women, they are really claiming their own superiority. The narrator believes life is difficult for both genders, and that it requires self-confidence. Self-confidence is often attained, she believes, by considering other people inferior in relation to oneself. She says that throughout history, women have served as models of inferiority who enlarge the superiority of men. Looking glasses possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size. Men logically become angry and defensive if women ever criticize them. Then, since women cease to be inferior and the men accordingly lose the status of superiority on which they are dependent. The narrator pays her bill, and is grateful for the inheritance left her by her aunt. She learned she would receive £500 a year for her life around the same time women gained the right to vote, and she believes the money is more important. Prior to that she had earned money on the odd jobs available to women before 1918. She hated doing that work, feeling like a fearful slave whose soul was rusting. Now, every time she pays for something with part of her inheritance, she feels the rust and the accompanying fear and bitterness are removed. She reasons that since nothing can take away her money and security, she need not hate or enslave herself to any man. Moreover, she feels that men, even with their wealth and power, contend with as major a problem as do powerless women. They are constantly trying to increase that power by subjugating others, and such efforts come at a heavy price. On the other hand, after her aunt's inheritance sank in, the narrator felt free to think of things in themselves. She could judge art, for instance, with greater objectivity. She walks home and sees various male and female workers on her street. She thinks about the relative values of the jobs. She believes that in 100 years, women will no longer be considered the protected gender, but will have access to the more grueling jobs as well. She wonders what this has to do with women and fiction. A room of one's own. Summary and analysis of Chapter 3. The narrator is disappointed at not having found an incontrovertible statement on why women are poorer than men. She decides to investigate women in Elizabethan England, puzzled why there were no women writers in that fertile literary period. She believes there is a deep connection between living conditions and creative works. She reads a history book and finds that women had few rights in the era, despite having strong personalities, especially in works of art. The narrator finds no material about middle-class women in the history book, and a host of her questions remain unanswered. She is reminded of a bishop's comment that no woman could equal the genius of Shakespeare, and her thoughts turn to Shakespeare. She imagines what would have happened had Shakespeare had an equally gifted sister named Judith. She outlines the possible course of Shakespeare's life: grammar school, marriage, work at a theatre in London, acting, meeting theatre people, and so on. His sister, however, was not able to attend school, and her family discouraged her from studying on her own. She was married against her will as a teenager and ran away to London. The men at the theatre denied her the chance to work and learn the craft. Impregnated by a theatrical man, she committed suicide. This is how the narrator believes such a female genius would have fared in Shakespeare's time. However, she agrees with the bishop that no women at the time would have had such genius, for genius like Shakespeare's is not born among laboring, uneducated, servile people, and women back then fit into this category. Nevertheless, some kind of genius must have existed among women then, as it exists among the working class, although it never translated to paper. Even if a woman surmounted various obstacles and wrote something, it would have been anonymous. The narrator questions what state of mind is most amenable to creativity. She finds that creating a work of art is extraordinarily difficult, privacy and money are scarce, and the world is generally indifferent to whether or not someone writes. For women in the past, the conditions were even harsher. The privacy of a private room or vacations was a rarity. Moreover, the world was not only indifferent to female writers, but actively opposed their creativity. Over time, the effect on a budding female writer is very detrimental. The narrator believes this male discouragement accords with the masculine desire to retain the status of superiority. Unfortunately, genius is often the most susceptible to the opinions of others. She believes the mind of the artist must be incandescent like Shakespeare's, without any obstacles. She argues that the reason we know so little about Shakespeare's mind is because his work filters out his personal grudges and spites and antipathies. His absence of personal protest makes his work free and unimpeded. A Room of One's Own summary of Chapter 4. The narrator reflects again that no women of Shakespeare's genius lived in Elizabethan times. More plausibly, an aristocratic lady of the time might have written something. The narrator believes that if such a lady wrote, however, fear and hatred would have been marred her writing. She cites the poetry of the noble Lady Winchelsea, which she finds stifled by its fear and hatred of men. Had she not been so consumed with these negative, imprisoning emotions, the narrator believes she would have written brilliant verse. The narrator turns her attention to the Duchess Margaret of Newcastle, a contemporary of Lady Winchelsea. Both women were noble, married to good men, and childless. The narrator reads her verse and feels she suffers from the same personal grievances. Had she lived today, she believes, the lonely Margaret would have been a far better poet. The narrator contemplates Dorothy Osborne, a more sensitive, melancholy Elizabethan figure who wrote only letters, as a proper woman did, and not poetry. The narrator believes she had a great gift, but that her letters betrayed Dorothy's insecurity over her writing. For the narrator, the writer Aphra Behn marks a turning point. A middle-class woman whose husband's death forced her to earn her own living. Behn's triumph over circumstances surpasses even her excellent writing. Behn is the first female writer to have freedom of the mind, and the narrator believes she inspired other girls to follow her self-sufficient example. Unfortunately, the literary girl's parents frequently rejected these plans in the interest of women's chastity, and the door was slammed faster than ever. Still, countless 18th-century middle-class female writers and beyond owe a great debt to Behn's breakthrough of earning money from writing. The earning of money, the narrator argues, goes far in eliminating the sneers against women's writing. The narrator is confused why the wealth of women's writing in the 19th century offers almost exclusively novels after women had originally begun with poetry. She thinks about what the four famous and divergent female novelists George Eliot, Emily, and Charlotte Bronte, and Jane Austen had in common besides being childless. Oddly, their middle-class status would have meant less privacy and a greater inclination toward writing poetry or plays, which require less concentration. Austen, for example, is known to have hidden her manuscripts when interrupted in her family's sitting room. However, the 19th-century middle-class woman was trained in the art of social observation, and the novel was a natural fit for her talents. The narrator finds that the work of Austen did not suffer from her lack of privacy, nor was it racked by hatred or fear. Though she thinks that Charlotte Bronte may have had more genius in her, Bronte has some hatred in her which disfigures her genius. Perhaps most among the foursome, she could have benefited from more money, experience, and travel. The narrator considers the varying effects the same novel can have on multiple readers. What makes a novel universal is integrity, which he defines as truthfulness. Does the writer's gender impact her integrity? Looking at Bronte's work, the narrator feels that beyond anger and resentment, the fear in it leads to some degree of ignorance. The narrator also argues that traditionally masculine values and topics in novels such as war are valued more than feminine ones, such as drawing room character studies. Female writers, then, were often forced to adjust their writing to meet the inevitable criticism that their work was insubstantial. Even if they did so without anger, they deviated from their original visions and their books suffered. The narrator finds it miraculous that in such a climate, Austen and Emily Bronte were able to write their books with such confidence and integrity. Only they ignored the sniping, critical chorus against them. Furthermore, the early 19th century female novelist had no real tradition from which to work. Though she may have learned some things from male writers, the narrator believes that the weight, the pace, the stride of a man's mind are too unlike her own for her to lift anything substantial from him successfully. For instance, there was no common sentence available for a woman's use, as the standard 19th century sentence was fitted for men to adapt to their own uses. While Charlotte Bronte and Eliot failed with that sentence, Austen created her own natural, shapely sentence that enabled deeper expression. The narrator argues that the novel was the chosen form for these women since it was a relatively new and pliable medium. She wonders if women will come up with some new vehicle for the poetry within them. She ceases her remarks about the future of writing to question the effect of frequent interruptions on women's books. A Room of One's Own summary of Chapter 5. The narrator looks at her shelf of contemporary books by both men and women on a variety of topics women could not have written about a generation ago. She feels the female writer, now given a broader education, no longer needs the novel as a means of self-expression. She takes down a recent debut novel called Life's Adventure, or some such title, by Mary Carmichael. Viewing Carmichael as a descendant of Lady Winchelsea, Aphra Behn, and the other female writers she has commented on, the narrator dissects Life's Adventure. First, she finds the prose style uneven, perhaps as a rebellion against the flowery reputation of women's writing. The narrator reconsiders, maybe Carmichael is purposely deceiving the reader with unexpected stylistic shifts. She reads on and finds the simple sentence Chloe liked Olivia. She believes the idea of friendship between two women is groundbreaking in literature, as women have historically been viewed in literature only in relation to men. Romance, the narrator believes, plays a minor role in a woman's life, but the excessive concern fictional women have for it accounts for their extreme portrayals as beautiful and good versus horrific and depraved. By the 19th century, women grew more complex in novels, but the narrator still believes that each gender is limited in its knowledge of the opposite sex. She reads on and discovers that Chloe and Olivia share a laboratory. The narrator reflects more on how impoverished literature would be if men were viewed only as lovers of women. She believes that if Carmichael writes with some genius, then her book will be very important. She reads another scene with the two women in it and thinks it is a sight that has never been seen since the world began. Her high hopes for Carmichael's description of the intricacies of the female mind make the narrator realize she has betrayed her original aim, not to praise her own sex. She recognizes that for whatever mental greatness they have, women have not yet made much of a mark in the world compared to men. Still, she believes that the great men in history often depended on women for providing them with some stimulus, some renewal of creative power that other men could not. She argues that the creativity of men and women is different, and that it would be 1,000 pities if women wrote like men, for if two sexes are quite inadequate, considering the vastness and variety of the world, how should we manage with one only? The narrator believes Carmichael has much work to do merely as an observer. She will have to go without kind or condescension into the lives of the courtesan and harlot whom male writers have stereotyped. However, the narrator fears Carmichael will still write about these controversial subjects with self-consciousness. Yet there are countless other women whose lives are unrecorded, and Carmichael will have to do them justice as she discovers her own mind, but she will have to do so without anger against men. Moreover, Since everyone has a blind spot about themselves, only a woman such as herself can fill out the portrait of men in literature. However, upon reading more of Carmichael's novel, the narrator feels the author is no more than a clever girl, even though she bears no traces of anger or fear. In 100 years, the narrator believes, and with money and a room of her own, Carmichael will be a better writer. A room of one's own. Summary of Chapter 6. The narrator reflects on the general public's understandable indifference to literature on the morning of October 26, 1928. She watches a young man and woman get into a taxi, and their unity soothes her. She wonders if her thoughts these past 2 days of men and women as different have been straining. She wonders what unity of the mind means, since the mind always changes its focus. Perhaps the unity of the man and woman in the taxi is satisfying because the mind contains both a male and female part, and for complete satisfaction and happiness, the two must live in harmony. This fusion, she believes, is what poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge was describing when he said a great mind is androgynous. Coleridge did not mean that the androgynous mind favors women in any way. In fact, it does this less than the single-sexed mind. Rather, the androgynous mind transmits emotion without impediment. It is naturally creative, incandescent and undivided. Shakespeare is a fine model of this androgynous mind, though it is harder to find current examples in this stridently sex-conscious age. She believes the suffrage campaign for the women's vote provoked men's defensiveness over their own sex. She reads a new novel by a well-respected male writer. The writing is clear and strong, indicative of a free mind, but she later notices he protests against the equality of the other sex by asserting his own superiority, and this is as destructive an impediment as any. Only the androgynous mind can foster perpetual life in its reader's mind. The narrator blames both sexes for bringing about this self-consciousness of gender. She judges the androgyny of various famous writers. She iterates her idea: if a writer's mind is purely male or female, if there is not total freedom of thought, then the writing will not be fertilized. The taxi takes away the man and woman. Woolf takes over the speaking voice. She says she will respond to 2 anticipated criticisms of the narrator. First, she says she purposely did not express an opinion on the relative merits of the 2 genders, especially as writers, since she does not believe such a judgment is possible or desirable. Second, her audience may believe the narrator laid too much emphasis on material things, and that the mind should be able to overcome poverty and lack of privacy. She cites a professor's argument that of the top poets of the last century, all but 3 were well educated, and all but Keats were fairly well off. Without material things, she repeats, one cannot have intellectual freedom, and without intellectual freedom, one cannot write great poetry. Women, who have been poor since the beginning of time, have understandably not yet written great poetry. She also responds to the question of why she insists women's writing is important. As an avid reader, the overly masculine writing in all genres has disappointed her lately. Moreover, she believes that good writers make good human beings who are intimately connected with reality, and who may communicate this heightened sense of reality to their readers. She encourages her audience to be themselves and think of things in themselves. She reminds them of what men have thought of women. She admits that the young women in the audience have made few significant strides in life, even though numerous opportunities have been opened up for them. She says that Judith Shakespeare still lives within all women, and that if women are given money and privacy in the next century, she will be reborn. Thank you.